This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I just finished reading Sasha Sagan's For Small Creatures Such as We. That's all about the human need for ritual. And here we are in the holiday season. We've just had Thanksgiving in the US, and we're looking at Christmas time, or Hanukkah, or Kwanzaa, or Saturnalia, or whatever tradition that you follow to gather and reflect on the year. And I think that Sasha is correct that these are really important moments that we use as prompts to really reflect, to really think about the things that we are grateful for, to hope for the future. And I encourage you to take that time during the holiday season to intentionally reflect on these things. I do hope to have Sasha on the podcast in the very near future, and I recommend highly that you pick up her book. I love Christmas time, and one of the interesting things about now being an atheist is the difference in perspective on the Christmas holiday. One of the things that I notice now that I didn't before is almost the desperate need for belief, or as Dan Dennett talks about it, belief in belief. And in this case, we're talking about just Santa Claus. But notice when you watch the Hallmark specials and all the Christmas stories, movies and television programs, the incessant push to believe, believe, believe. Your secular grace thought of the week is this: it is okay not to believe without evidence. You are not a bad person if you are a doubter. You can be concerned with the truth and unwilling to accept bad arguments. On to today's show. When I began the podcast, I really envisioned doing these kinds of episodes more often. And the idea was to have believers on who could interview me. There is much hand-wringing about trying to prove one's former belief to the believers around us in our lives. And I thought that maybe it would make sense to have believers come on, ask me hard questions, and allow me to respond to those. Originally, I had called it A Believer Interviews the Graceful Atheist. And it turns out that that's hard. Interviewing actually takes a certain skill set. So I've kind of changed that around to more of a 20 questions scenario where I ask the believer questions and the believer asks me questions. And I have another of these lined up here in the very near future as well. But today's guest is Sarah. Sarah is the believing spouse of a atheist who is I wouldn't necessarily use the word activist. He is very strongly out there. He is a vocal communicator of secularism and atheism. And so I thought that this would be a very interesting conversation. The other topic that seems to be a continual theme throughout the podcast has been, how do a believing spouse and a non-believing spouse make it work? And although I don't have any answers for you, my conversation today with Sarah explores some of those ideas. And the other important thing to remember is that when we tell our believing family and friends that we no longer believe, we have to remember that they are at step zero. They have no framework to understand what we've gone through. We've gone through the emotions of it, we've gone through the doubting, we've gone through the research, and they have not. And this can be really painful for the believing spouse or the believing family member. And so we need to have some compassion, dare I say, secular grace, for the believers in our lives when we tell them that we no longer believe. It is important that we validate the feelings of the believers in our lives. They might be hurt, they might be angry, they might be hostile, they might be going through a wide range of emotions, all of which is natural and normal. And if we try to minimize or invalidate their feelings, then that's on us and not them. I am not saying that this is easy. This is extremely hard. It is very difficult. What I'm saying is, this is the goal. You're probably sick of me saying this over and over again. But there are some relationships that are going to be important to you. It's easy to burn those bridges and walk away from. From a recent podcast with Brian Peck, he reminded me that just because you have a blow up, an argument, doesn't mean that's the end of the relationship. And that's fantastic. But I am trying to talk about avoiding catastrophic mistakes that could damage a relationship. And that begins with recognizing the humanity of our family members and loved ones who are still believers. I want to thank Sarah for being on the podcast. She was incredibly brave. She is a dedicated Christian who's highly involved in her church. She articulates her faith extremely well here. I respect her very much for coming on the program and ultimately meeting me in an honesty contest, the ethos of the podcast. And without further delay, I give you Sarah. Sarah, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you.
So, Sarah, I've been very excited about our conversation. One of the areas that I see that is very lacking is a discussion between believers and people who have left the faith, and in particular, in cases where there are very tight bonds, relationships, for example, in marriages.
Okay.
So I understand that you are a believer and that you are married to someone who is out as an atheist.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want just a little bit of background there and just
Sure.
sort of our history?
Yeah.
So I've been married to Matt for 25 years. When we met, we were both believers. We were both we actually met at church. We were both heavily involved in church and church activities. We married in church in 1994, and life went on. We continued as a couple, a Christian couple. Our social life revolved around church and our church friends, and that's how we were as a couple. And that was the case really for the first 10 to 15 years of our marriage.
Okay.
So that's the background.
Yeah, and just to set up a little bit of my story as well, it's very similar. I met my wife at Bible college. We did go our separate ways briefly, but we came back together and got married. And our Christianity was very much a part of that relationship. And for 15-ish years, somewhere in that neighborhood, that was the case before things started to change for me personally. So kind of similar stories. And this is why I'm so excited about having you on. And again, this is something that I just see really lacking out there, that people who go through what I call a deconversion experience, this loss of faith, but whichever term you'd like to use would be fine, who are still married to a believing spouse, there just isn't very many resources out there. So I think that this conversation will be very valuable.
I'm inclined to agree with you, David. And I would say as well that a lot of Christians in particular don't understand it. And in fact, when I first told Christian friends of mine that my husband used to be a Christian and had deconverted, many of them were a little surprised,
right,
to say the least. And some of them perhaps shocked, more to the point. And it's a strange reaction that you get from Christians when you tell them that somebody that you know has deconverted. A lot of Christians don't know how to deal with that. So I also welcome this conversation, and perhaps may even signpost a few of my Christian friends towards it.
That's actually a really interesting perspective from the believer side, talking about a loved one who has deconverted and the response to that. That's really interesting. Before we jump in too deeply here, Sarah, I'd really like to hear a little bit more about you and your relationship with God. Can you tell us how you grew up? Did you grow up in a believing family? When do you feel like you made a decision to be a Christian?
Yeah, sure. I grew up, I was raised in church, in the Church of England, very traditional, I suppose, traditional English faith. For those of you that don't understand the Church of England, it's very much in this country. It's an established church that historically most people would belong to the Church of England, and so it's a very conservative faith, and that's how I was raised by my parents. When I was a teenager, I made that decision that my faith was going to become my own, and it very much did become my own. I didn't follow that very conservative route that my parents had been down, and I pursued all sorts of different areas of Christianity, sort of more Pentecostal areas that they certainly hadn't been down. I loved worship. Sung worship was a huge thing for me. I love music, I love singing, so I got involved in sort of the more modern contemporary worship, whereas I'd been raised singing in a church choir very traditionally. So I followed that path. I stayed in the Church of England, and in fact that's where I met Matt, and we got married in the church in which I'd grown up. And now I would consider myself not Church of England. I would consider myself just a Christian. Denominations in England are not quite as black and white as they are perhaps in the States. I go to a Baptist church, but our beliefs are broadly similar right across the church spectrum in the UK. So a Baptist church might be very, very similar in its style and in its belief to a Church of England church or a Methodist church or a United Reformed church. So I would say I'm a Christian. I happen to go to a Baptist church. I wouldn't call myself a Baptist.
So obviously, I'm sure you know from just the politics of late that in the United States, the evangelical Christianity has a fair amount of political weight over here, and the evangelicals refer to themselves as born again. Is that something that you identify with at all?
Yeah, I mean, biblically, being born again is simply repenting, turning away from your sins, and starting a new life in Christ. So
sure.
I would say that you really couldn't call yourself a Christian unless you considered yourself a born again Christian, somebody who has turned away from the old life and started your new life in Christ, which is to be your eternal life. The distinction in the States I do find quite interesting, and I don't know very much about it, but I find that from what I know, some people who are arguing the conservative Christian point of view in the States tend to be what I would call, well, certainly in this country, churchgoers rather than Christians.
Yeah, actually, I'm actually sorry that I brought up politics at all. I really.
You should see what's happening with politics in this country today.
I am. I'm a little familiar. Yeah, but I want to just key in on one of your statements that the idea of being born again, of repenting from your sins, of turning towards God, is what it means to be born again, and that is kind of, if I'm not stating it too strongly, your definition of what a Christian is.
I believe so. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I would say that's what a Christian is somebody who is born again.
Okay, and so for the record, just to be super clear, I would have definitely identified that way. I would have called myself born again for those exact same reasons. So just to get that out there.
Okay.
Did you ever consider working in ministry at all, or?
Not. I mean, as I said, I'm very passionate about sung worship and music and that sort of thing, and this may come up when we're talking a little bit later more about Matt and myself and our relationship, but more recently, since his deconversion, there was an opportunity for me to go into ministry, and that was a source of tension. So we'll come back to that. I don't want to jump ahead to that point in time, but I mean, suffice it to say that I am very, very involved in my church. I do preach regularly. I do lead services, and so I have, I suppose, what you might call giftings that would work if I was to be called into the ministry. But at the moment, that's not on my radar. So, yeah, for various reasons.
I guess what I'm trying to establish here is that you're a very active participant. You're a very dedicated person that is, as far as your relationship with God, with your...
Absolutely.
You're acting it out. You're living it out.
Absolutely.
I think it's almost cliche to talk about, but have you ever had a long night of the soul where you've had any doubts at all?
Well, I mean, I've been a Christian for over 30 years now. So, I mean, I'd be lying if I said, no, I haven't had doubts. I have had doubts. I've been through periods of doubt. Nothing, I don't think, that's ever made me think I want to walk away from this. It's more been about frustration with church situations and, sort of being annoyed at fellow Christians. So I think that doubt and faith kind of go hand in hand, really, don't they? You've got to question in order to strengthen your faith. And certainly, having a husband who's a non-believer makes you question, because he's posing those questions and he's answered those questions himself and come to a different conclusion to perhaps the one that I have come to and am coming to every day.
Right.
So yes, there are moments of doubt and there are periods of doubt, and they have never led me so far away from the faith.
Okay. Again, I think I'm just establishing that you've thought very hard about these things.
Sure.
And just as you say, that you've wrestled with them much like Matt has, but you come to differing conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So let's move towards a little bit more about your relationship with Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
It escapes me the exact amount of time ago that it was that Matthew lost his faith. But
mm-hmm.
when he first told you, what was that experience like?
Okay, so just to give you some context, we had been married for about 14 years, and we were in a church in, we used to live in Hampshire in the southeast of the UK, and we were attending a Baptist church. Neither of us were particularly happy in that church at the time. We weren't happy with the leadership. The leadership of that church were taking it in a direction that we were uncomfortable with. We didn't personally find the leadership very easy to get on with. And so Matt stopped attending church. We had a 4-year-old daughter at the time. He stopped attending church, and I put that down to the fact that he was unhappy with the leadership. I ploughed on through and I kept going. I had a lot of friends there. I was very committed there, so I kept going. In 2011, so 3 years on from that, we made the decision to move area, not for church reasons, for other reasons. And we moved about 100 miles away to Somerset, the southwest of the UK, and we joined, I joined, we started going to a new church. And it was the first couple of weeks at that new church, Matt came along with me, and of course I just naively thought, changing church, this is exactly what we need. He will now start going to this church. We made an instant connection with the pastor. He was a great guy, really, really great guy. Matt and he hit it off really well. Found out they had some things in common, had similar interests, and I thought, great, this is really good, this is what we needed. And it was a few weeks after we'd come to the area, and I raised the issue of church membership. And we have a system in the Baptist church here in the UK where generally you are a member of that church, which means that you have a vote in the church meeting. And because we'd left one Baptist church and were going to another, it made sense to me to resign our membership in the old church and become members of the new church.
Okay.
And it was at that point that the pastor then said to us, okay, I'll come round and have a chat to you, because before I recommend you as members, it's only right that I get to know you. And Matt said to me, I said that this chat had been organised, and he said to me, I can't do it. And this is when he told me, on a Friday night, we were walking on the beach, and he told me that he had lost his faith. So this came as not a shock, but I suppose in some ways a shock. I had perhaps been naive because he'd not been going to church for 3 years, and I just thought it was to do with the leadership. So yes, it was a shock.
Okay.
It was a huge shock. And I failed to grasp the enormity of it, because I remember kind of saying to him at the time, well, obviously I'd quite like you to still come to church with me, because I'd just joined a new church. I hadn't established friends and relationships there in the church. And the last thing I wanted was to be turning up on my own, or with our daughter, who was 6 then, and have to do that on my own. I wanted him by my side. So I kind of naively said, I'd like you to keep coming to church. And it just, it just didn't really register with me what his loss of faith meant. I thought, well, he could just be a, nominal churchgoer. We're still a, quotes, Christian family.
Right.
So that's how he told me. I had no idea up until then. That 3-year period between him stopping going to church and us moving, maybe I was in denial, I don't know. But I really didn't know.
I'm recognizing a number of parallels between my wife and I, and maybe we'll get into that when you ask me some questions. I guess my biggest question for you was, were you more angry or hurt, or what was the emotion that you were feeling when that happened?
I don't think I was anything really to start with. I don't recall immediately feeling anger. I think the shock of it, the surprise of it had the effect of kind of numbing me to those any immediate sort of emotions. I wasn't thinking ahead. I wasn't thinking about the future. I was thinking about the here and now and, well, what do we do now? I wasn't thinking about the implications of it particularly. It's difficult. I'm sort of, it's a long time ago now, so I'm trying to sort of pull it up from the depths of my mind, because a lot of water has passed under the bridge since. But I really don't think that I had any immediate feelings of anger towards him. Maybe I thought it was a flash in the pan, and maybe I thought he would come back. Perhaps I didn't grasp the strength of his feelings and the finality of the decision that he had made. Later on, I did get angry. I found myself being quite angry that he didn't discuss it with me. And every now and then, those feelings of anger kind of just come to the surface again, because I think, well, this decision that you made on your own affects us. It affects both of us hugely.
Yeah.
It is about the core of our relationship has always been centered around the church and around being Christians. And it was right from day one when we met and started to go out together, we started to pray together, and that had obviously lessened off. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have known somewhere between 2008 and 2011 that he'd lost his faith, but we had stopped praying together, obviously. But this was the core of our relationship, and he made this decision without any discussion with me, without any reference to me, and it seemed to me like such a huge decision to have made without involving me in it. And there are times when I sort of think, well, maybe if we'd had a chance to talk about it, then maybe your decision would have been different. But there we are. It's still something that is definitely there in my mind even after all these years.
So I said off mic and in our email that I won't be spending any time defending Matthew here. But what I would like to do is just share my experience when I was on the other side of that equation.
Mm-hmm.
My wife has told me that she knew before I did.
Okay.
That she sensed things were not right.
Mm-hmm.
And one example is maybe a couple of years before I lost my faith, I read through the Bible again. Mm-hmm. And I'd be reading and and I would be kind of frustrated. And some of that frustration would come out in our family life with her and the kids. And she began to recognize that. I started to back away from the very public prayer kinds of things.
Okay.
Going in to pray for my children. If we did a family gathering, I did not want to be the person to pray. Keep in mind that during this time, I would have said I was very much a believer.
Okay.
I wasn't maybe even aware of what was happening. And when it did kind of all come to a crash, and it's interesting because Matthew is one of the most eloquent people I've heard to describe this. He said that the loss of faith happened suddenly, but the suddenly describes his awareness, not the process.
Okay.
I could not identify more with the statement.
Mm-hmm.
The process took years. The process was years in the making, but my awareness of it was very, very sudden. And over the month or so that I took to tell my wife, all I can tell you, Sarah, is that I was panicked that I would lose her.
Okay.
And I understood that what I was about to tell her was going to twist the knife in her heart, and that the contract that we had made for our relationship was being broken by me. Even with all of that, knowing how bad that was going to hurt, I knew I had to tell her. I had to be honest with her. Like I could not just go through the motions. And I relate a lot to what you've described. We have long periods of time where we don't think about it at all and things are great. and then something will bubble up and we have a pretty tense conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess what the thing I want to get across is that any response, anger, hurt, shock, is a valid response.
Hmm.
The assumption of why the relationship started has kind of been broken, and I get that.
Hmm.
I understand that. I can only say that from the other side, it's just as panic inducing
Hmm.
to feel the risk of losing someone who you love dearly.
Hmm. Okay. I hear what you're saying. And in fact, that does tie in with in the early days after Matt had told me, he was reading a blog by a lady, a young woman from the States who was, I believe, now I can't see if I'm remembering this rightly because I don't remember her name, but she was a Christian lady married to an atheist, and they were wrestling with this idea of being unequally yoked. And in fact, the way that that ended was that she left her husband and went off with her Christian best friend, and divorced her husband and married her Christian best friend. And that was we had discussions in the early days surrounding this blog about whether or not we could survive as a Christian and a non-Christian in marriage. And he did voice that. He said he was terrified that we might go the same way as the couple that blog was about. And I did my best to reassure him, because I think when he first told me, the furthest thing from my mind was, well, that's it, then we're going to have to separate, it's not going to work. That just did not cross my mind at all. What was going through my mind was, well, how can we make this work, and how can we
Right.
find common ground and work on the things that we both believe to be true. It never crossed my mind for a moment that we would have to separate, certainly not in those early days.
Okay. I imagine that there's, again, just as much variety in people's responses
Hmm.
as there are
Yeah.
people, but that's interesting to hear. So it's also a good segue. So you brought up the term unequally yoked.
Hmm.
Obviously, that is something that is described in the Bible.
Hmm.
It's talked about in the church.
Hmm.
How do you personally manage that? How are things going with your relationship today?
The first thing to say here is I think you've got to be really careful not to confuse normal marital issues with issues surrounding faith, because we know that no marriage is perfect and everybody has their issues. And I think you've got to be very careful when you're talking about being unequally yoked that you're talking just about issues of faith. So that's the first thing I'd say, and that's as much a reminder to myself as it is to anybody else. Every marriage has its problems, and just be careful what you're putting down to faith and not just normal marital problems.
Right.
Having said that, I think we have definitely had our challenges. We are definitely still having huge challenges, and perhaps this is why it has taken me 8 years to talk about it, because sometimes it's still very, very, very raw, and some of those challenges are daily. So it's not, by any stretch of the imagination, it's not easy. I think I said I'm heavily involved in my church. I do lead services and I preach. That in itself can be a challenge. I feel that when I'm planning to preach, when I'm preparing to preach, I spend a lot of time and energy into preparing a sermon. I'm very aware that that takes me away from family time because it takes up my weekend time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very aware that church takes me away from family time. And I'm almost hyper aware. So if I know I have to go to a church meeting or a church event at a weekend when it would otherwise be family time, outside of the normal Sunday service, which I think is accepted, but if I have to put time into church, I am hyper aware of the fact that that takes time away from us as a couple and us as a family, and I don't like doing it. That means I'm torn, really. I'm torn between my church, my faith, and I'm torn between my family. And there's that tension that's always there. That affects my behavior, definitely does. I get very, very, really quite cross with myself. I get cross with the church. I get cross with Matt and the situation that we're in as a result of that. So there's that tension there. That's a time thing. And then the other challenge, I think, is I'm quite happy to talk intellectually about the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm quite happy to defend my faith on matters of the Bible. I don't mind a good discussion about something that's in the Bible. I'm usually fairly confident in my Bible knowledge and in defending my faith. And if there's something I don't know, I'll say, I don't know that, but I'll go away and find out.
Right.
Matt's Bible knowledge, I have to say, is probably a lot better than mine. His upbringing was in a missionary school and they had to learn huge chunks of the Bible. So he knows the Old Testament far better than I do. I'm fine with having an intellectual discussion with him. What I find incredibly hard is when I feel I'm being challenged on something that is a church activity or a faith activity. And I'll give you an example of that. At our church at the moment, we are running something called the Alpha Course. Do you have this in the States?
No, but I think Matthew has mentioned it to me.
Okay.
Interested to hear you describe it from your perspective.
Okay, so the Alpha Course is the course for people who are seeking, who are interested in Christianity, who want to know more about Christianity. And it's a series of videos or talks, but generally done by video. It's usually presented over a course of 10 weeks, 10 evenings. People who want to come along, they have a meal, they watch the video, and then they talk about matters of faith.
Okay.
It's all aimed at, I mean, it's really just looking at the gospel, but it's looking at all the different parts of the gospel, and it's looking at the Bible and church and prayer and all of those things that go with faith. And it gives people an opportunity to ask questions and then to make up their mind. It's been a very effective course. It's all over the UK. It's in many churches run it. It's run in prisons. It's run in all sorts of places, and it's run throughout the world as well in different countries. So it's a very effective course. A lot of people who do the Alpha Course find that they are challenged, convinced, whatever, I don't know.
Okay.
It definitely draws people into the faith.
Sure.
So we're running the Alpha Course. Alongside that, we're running something called Youth Alpha, which is designed for teenagers. So it's the same material, but presented in a kind of a younger way. So the videos are a little bit, more up to the minute. And our daughter's doing the Youth Alpha Course. She's 15, our daughter. She's already, I have to say, she's already made a declaration of faith in her baptism, but she's chosen to go along and do the Youth Alpha Course, and she had taken a friend with her as well, who has since dropped out of the course. But Matt directly challenged me particularly on the Youth Alpha course. He doesn't like Alpha in general, but he really doesn't like Youth Alpha. And he challenged me in a way that actually really upset me at the time.
Okay.
He said that he considered it indoctrination, and he was very uncomfortable with it. And so there ensued a couple of discussions over the course of a couple of weeks about this. And it was one of those things that I found I was very upset by. I'm not sure that he grasped how upset I was about it, but he wanted to keep pushing the point. And it, as I said, I find it very easy to have an intellectual discussion about the Bible, but when he's pushing on matters of, particularly when it's something that's quite personal, or it's about evangelism or something like that, I react probably quite badly.
Okay. That's honest.
I'm accepting that some of that might be my own insecurity, I don't know, but I didn't have a good reaction to that challenge. So I think the big issue for me there is, where do we draw the line on what we discuss?
Right.
It is difficult because Matt knows how churches work. I mean, he grew up in churches. He's been in churches for years. And so he knows, for example, that people at church pray for him. He doesn't want to know that. So I don't come home and rub that in his face. I've had prayer partners, and we've prayed for him week after week. I don't sort of say to him, oh, we prayed for you tonight, because I know he doesn't want to know that. So that's where I would draw the line. But I may want to discuss a biblical matter with him. Do you see the distinction that I'm making?
I totally do. And let me try to just jump in with my experience with my wife. So it's interesting that you say that you would be open to having a discussion about a biblical matter. I find that my wife, I don't think she trusts me enough yet.
Okay.
this is the only negative thing I'm going to say, in that I try to express to her that I love her. That includes for her, the wholeness of who she is includes her spirituality and her relationship with God.
Okay.
And so I actually care about that she feels spiritually fulfilled for whatever definition either of us uses for spirituality. And so I'd be very much open to having discussions about the Bible, about church activities, that kind of thing. And what I would try to withhold as much negativity as possible. That hasn't happened. I see that as my not yet conveying enough security for her to be able to do that. So I find that distinction interesting. The other thing that you point out that I find interesting, I think lots of people in relationships that have this imbalance, is how you manage the children is very, very difficult.
Sure. Yeah.
My personal approach has been to say to my girls that whatever they choose, I will support them. But I'll be honest, I'm also teaching them critical thinking skills. We have kind of a joke in the family about bad advertising. When we see an ad, we'll talk about like, what is the manipulation that's happening there? And all of this to say that I don't know what they will eventually choose as they face the world when they get to college age and that kind of thing. And so in that sense, my wife and I are at odds, which I can't really help, right?
No, sure.
So I can appreciate the anxiety that Matt might have been feeling. And again, without defending however he handled that, there is the sense of, I don't want my children manipulated.
Sure.
And from this perspective, some of that can feel like manipulation.
Sure. I do also understand where he's coming from, because I have to take this into account. As I mentioned, he was brought up in a missionary kids school in Zambia in Africa. He was never, if you like, given the choice. He wasn't taught that critical thinking. He started going to this school when he was 5, and he was a boarder. And you can imagine boarding at school hundreds of miles away from mum and dad when you are 5. And the teachers, the staff who are caring for you are your parents effectively. And so you trust and you believe what they're telling you. So if they're telling you that the Bible is inerrant and this is exactly how it happened, then you're going to believe them. And so he wasn't given those opportunities to think about this stuff himself. He was told that this is the way that it is, and he believed it. And that's really how he continued and went on until he started to question himself as an adult. And so I do understand where he's coming from. And he does teach our daughter critical thinking very, very much. And he accepts, she was baptized 2 years ago, and he came to her baptism and he listened to her testimony. And so he accepts that she has made those decisions herself.
Right.
Those aren't decisions. Those aren't things that she's taken lightly. She's put thought into them and maturity, and she's made those decisions herself. And so pretty much like you, I suppose, he has let her make those decisions, but he doesn't stop challenging her. And obviously he's easy on her because she's 15, but
sure.
he doesn't challenge her in the way that he challenges me, but he does challenge her.
Well, I feel like we could keep going down this road, and maybe we'll return to some of this, but I promised you some time to ask some questions of me.
Okay.
So I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask some questions, and I want to just reiterate that in no way am I saying that I represent Matthew, nor am I saying that I represent all atheists. Just in the same way that you don't represent all Christians.
Sure.
But I've asked you to prepare a few questions, and I just want to give you the opportunity, and I will try to honestly and as openly as possible answer those questions. So.
Okay. So I think you've answered some of them already. So I'm going to go, first of all, with questions specifically about you, and then move on to this issue of being unequally yoked and what that means for you practically. But
sure.
The question that frustrates me, Matt's never been able to answer for me, is regarding his, it's really difficult to know how to put this, but his enthusiasm for, if you like, defending atheism. And by that I mean being involved in the atheist community, doing the podcasts, writing the blogs, being just part of that whole community. And I think this is best illustrated by something that was around in the UK a few years ago. The Humanist Society is quite big in the UK. I don't know if you have the Humanist Society in the States, but
Yeah.
a few years ago, they carried out a campaign and they put big posters and big signs up on the sides of buses and things. And those signs said, "There's probably no God, so stop worrying and enjoy life."
Right.
And and I kind of think to myself sometimes, absolutely right. That is, if you believe there is no God, why do you feel the need to talk about your atheism in the same way that Christians evangelize? Is it not just a matter of, I don't believe there's a God. In fact, strongly believe that there is no God. Why don't I just get on with life and enjoy it and forget about it?
Right.
Because it's of no impact. It doesn't impact me in any way. There is no God. It has no impact on my life. And I just wondered how you feel about that.
So, really valid question. I think that it'll take me a minute to try to give you a complete answer.
Okay.
If I step back for a second and say, so I do identify as a humanist.
Okay.
There is a sense in which, and you probably have heard this before, but that saying that I'm an atheist tells you very, very little about me.
Mm-hmm.
It answers one question, whether I
Mm-hmm.
think gods exist.
Mm-hmm.
That's not interesting. When I say that I am a humanist, what I personally mean is that our humanity and our relationships with other human beings are the most fulfilling aspects of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe that, or I should say, I don't believe in, say, nihilism. So the fact that there may not be inherent meaning in the universe doesn't mean that we don't make meaning. I think that part of being human is that
Mm-hmm.
we make our meaning.
Mm-hmm.
We tell ourselves stories, we connect with one another. And I believe that things like awe and belonging and connection with other people are the richness, the thriving in life.
Mm-hmm.
So when we walked, well, and I shouldn't say we, when I walked away, when I realized, and I'll make one clarification here, it wasn't me choosing not to believe.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think that belief is a choice. You are either convinced a thing is true or you're convinced that it is not true.
Okay.
And
Mm-hmm.
I was all in 100% 24 hours before. If you'd asked me the day before, how do you feel? I would have defended to the bone, and then the next day it was completely different. I was unconvinced.
Okay.
Trying to get back to your question. So when that happens, you lose a built-in sense of purpose.
Okay.
To serve God, to serve God's people. You lose a built-in community of people. You lose, potentially, you are risking relationships with your family members and friends.
Mm-hmm.
So all in one moment, and forgive me for cussing, but my immediate thought was, oh, hey, what am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
I was most worried about losing the people that I loved.
Mm-hmm.
So as you start to pick up the pieces after that kind of a paradigm shifting reality has changed underneath you experience,
Mm-hmm.
you are looking for ways to express meaning, to find purpose. You are looking for ways to connect with other people. You are looking for all of the things that religion provides.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, I personally think that humanism is a way of fulfilling that void. I think that humans need the community aspects of religion. We need to connect with each other. We need to spend time with each other. We need to do good for one another. We need to provide meaning for each other. All of those things are hardwired human needs. So none of that goes away when you suddenly decide that you don't believe. And one way that can express itself is to be online, to start to connect with other people who are going through the same process. What I found, my immediate experience was the first few months, I felt a little angry. I was a little angry. There's a lot of anger out online, and I identified with that for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But shortly thereafter, you start to go, yeah, okay, I've expressed that anger. Now what? I want to move on with my life. I want to do something.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And for me personally, and why I do this podcast, is I saw a lot of people still in that anger phase. They're going through the process, and the first thing they read is a Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris.
Okay. Yeah.
And not to disparage them, but to say there's some
Yeah.
anger there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm interested in, what do we do now? How do we express human goodness, kindness, love, all of those things without the framework of faith? And here's the other piece that I'll just say. I also talk to a lot of people who have been hurt deeply, not just by the church, because I think that's too easy. Sometimes Christians take that easy out. Oh, well, you were hurt, that's why you left. What I mean is they were hurt by the expectations they had of a loving, kind, interactive God who wasn't there. And so part of my purpose, part of the reason that I do what I do, is that I feel like that is that human connection. I'm connecting with these people. I'm walking alongside them. It's very ministry. I mean, it sounds a lot like what I would have said when I was a youth pastor, right? Like, I do these things. I do this because I want to care about people. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. That does make some sense. I see that from that point of view. I do find, I mean, I don't know what your engagement is on chat boards and that sort of thing when people are discussing, Christians and atheists are back and forth discussing matters of faith and matters of doctrine. Matt's quite involved in that, and I find some of the things, I mean, with good old Facebook, everything pops up on your timeline, even if you're tagged in it or not, you know, and some of the things he posts will pop up. And I find if I ever venture into reading those discussions, that there is a lot of anger on both sides there. And I kind of say to him sometimes, I don't even really understand why you're involved in this, because you are not going to convince anybody by arguing. You know, you're never going to argue anyone round to your point of view. And so I see what you're saying is actually about making connections with people. And that to me makes far more sense than trying to just argue with somebody that's already made their mind up. I've accepted that there's no way I'm going to argue Matt round to my point of view, so there is no point in having an argument with him. And I feel the same pretty much about those kind of chat boards. But do you get involved in that at all?
I don't. And again, I don't want to throw, sorry, Matt, I don't want to throw Matt under the bus here, but part of my message is to atheists to say, let's step back for a second. I tend to agree with you, Sarah, that arguing with people isn't helpful. If you read some of my work, I talk about that I want to have an honesty contest. Let's have a vulnerability contest. And that I think that is actually more powerful for my side, so to speak. And so one of the things I'll say is, who's trolling whom? I see Christians trolling atheists, and I see atheists trolling Christians. I find that to be just counterproductive, let's say. And I think if, as a secular person, as a humanist, if my goal is to have more critical thinking believers or more secular people, that the way to go about that is through that human connection and not through a frontal argument.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally 100% agree with you on that discussion needs to be one human to another and not challenging and not arguing, not confrontational at all.
Right.
And some of what I see online is very confrontational, and I don't think that that's helpful to anybody. So, and for what it's worth, I was thinking when you were talking about being a humanist, I think that if I wasn't a Christian, I probably would be a humanist. What I see, the way that I look at it, is that our humanity, we are made in the image of God, and therefore our humanity is God's character. And I definitely think that our humanity is very, very precious, and those connections with other human beings are very precious, but perhaps for a different reason than you do.
I completely understand. One of the things that I learned after all the research, so one thing that does happen after deconversion is you feel free to go research things that you felt constrained or things that you felt like you had to avoid before.
Yeah, sure.
And I would absolutely say that I was a religious humanist, and that has a long, rich history that you can look into from the turn of the 20th century and many other ways. There's a rich expression of humanism, not necessarily secular humanism, within the Christian tradition.
Okay.
And so it was a very natural step for me to, although I would not have identified that at the time, post Christianity for me to identify as humanist. And it sounds to me like you share many of those feelings. And
Yeah,
again, the
sure.
reasoning may be slightly different,
Yeah.
but the expression of that can be very similar.
My other question to you is a little bit more personal about
Sure.
your wife's involvement in church. How involved is she? How much time does she give to that? And how do you feel about that? Do you ever resent that? Do you ever resent the time she gives to the church? Do you feel that it's taking away from family time? And then as part of that, do the two of you ever socialize as a couple with other couples from the church?
So I think I've kind of answered this, but I'll refer back to a little bit. When I deconverted and I knew that I wanted to remain married to my wife, that my love was built on something other than just my former faith.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that I needed to, again, accept her for who she was rather than who I might want her to be.
Okay.
And that includes her faith. So from very early on, me personally, I was aware that that was something that I needed to support. And now she asked me very kind of similarly to you guys to keep going to church, which we did for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar to you guys as well. There's some changes in the home church that, as far as leadership goes, that I think has her in an ambiguous spot at the moment. And so we currently haven't been attending as much.
Mm-hmm.
But she is still very much involved. So she volunteers with a number of the services, things like Thanksgiving and Christmas food baskets, a number of different ministries at that church she continues to be a part of. And again, I support that.
Okay.
And often if she goes to, say, a Bible study or something, that's the evening that I will spend editing podcasts.
Sure. Yeah.
So for me, I see it as both of us fulfilling our need for, again, quote unquote, spirituality, however you want to define that.
Okay. Sure. I mean, that's good. And probably works similarly with us. I know if on Sunday mornings when I'm at church, that is Matt's morning to spend at his computer, either editing or recording or whatever he's doing at the time. So, or his time for gaming, console gaming.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
we joke about it, but
Yeah.
but it's true. You have this timing as a couple where you do things that are separate. I think sometimes my worry is that we are not finding enough common ground and we're not finding enough to do together. And, inevitably there are family things you do, you go on family day outs and that sort of thing. But the socializing things, what's quite funny is that because I tend to be the one that's out and about, Matt works long hours, so he doesn't get out locally very much. I tend to make the friends, and I've always said that women make the friends and the men socialise with the partners of the friends the women have made. But what's quite funny, and I don't know whether Matt will thank me for telling you this, but he turned 50 recently, and we had a bit of a birthday party meal for him at home here, and 3 of our friends' couples were invited. We had a dinner party, and the 3 couples consisted of 2 pastors and 1 ex-pastor.
Right.
All Christians, all active in the church,
right.
but all whom we consider to be our friends. So it's interesting how he will still usually, most often, socialize with our friends who are Christians.
I don't think I addressed that part of the question.
Yeah, sure.
Let me just say that our best friends are both very much Christians. My wife goes to a Bible study with her, and he is my best friend from years and years and years. You find out who your real friends are. So
yeah, you do.
They've been very accepting. Obviously, they disagree with me, but that's fairly open. The church theoretically knows about me.
Sure.
One of the volunteer coordinators gave me the offer, early on, if you want to talk to anyone. And I was like, sure, I'll talk to them, but they may not enjoy it.
Yeah.
So I want to be clear here that I'm being very careful in this conversation, but I can be as aggressive as I want to be when it comes to apologetics. If a person tells me that they believe based on faith, I would encourage that entirely. I don't agree, but I have nothing to say about that. If you say that there are these apologetic arguments, then the full force of logic, reason, evidence, history come into bear. And I think that there are times when apologetics specifically make very, very bad arguments. So you may hear me make those kinds of arguments.
I'm completely on the same page as you, David, because I've already said you can't argue somebody round to your point of view. And I think I respect the role that apologetics perhaps plays in maybe strengthening somebody's faith. Somebody who's already, a Christian, has already come to faith, may want to look at the apologetics arguments and think, yeah, that supports what I already believe to be true. I don't think that you can use those to argue somebody into the kingdom. I have never known anybody that has been argued into the kingdom.
Right.
It's not to say that there aren't people out there, but I don't think that you can be a Christian based purely on intellect. I think that there has to be a very strong faith and experience element to it.
I would tend to agree with you.
I respect that apologetics does have a small role. Personally, I'm not particularly interested in pursuing that myself.
Okay. I have, a handful of questions that are a little harder.
Yeah, no, go for it.
If you're willing, then we can do that. And if you're not, we won't.
Well, go for it and we'll see.
Okay. So I'm going to ask just one or two questions about you and your belief or your faith, and then some others about me as an atheist.
Okay.
So it's interesting that you bring up being maybe unhappy with leadership. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to make sure I accurately portray this at a particular church, or that there were times where you might be frustrated with other Christians. I can identify, but I am curious, in your mind, how do you know that you are correct and they are mistaken?
Goodness. The short answer is I don't. I have to go with what I am comfortable with. And I know you won't necessarily like that answer. From a human point of view, when I meet people, when I'm with people, and when I'm interacting with people, I like to see an integrity and an honesty. And it has been said of me that you'll always get an honest answer from me. And I believe that I am always honest, perhaps to a fault sometimes, perhaps sometimes too honest. When I feel that people are not being entirely honest, it makes me uncomfortable. And when I feel that that is the case, I question people's motives. And so in the particular case that I mentioned, I was uncomfortable with some of the things that were being said. They didn't quite ring true to me, and I began to question the motives of the person saying them.
Okay.
That was where I was at in that church. I would say that church, I mean, we moved away in 2011, and it has grown in size 2-3-fold and is doing incredible things in the community that it's in under that same leader. And so perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps it just didn't sit with me. Perhaps it was just personality. I never challenged the leader directly.
Okay.
And I was quite happy to keep my thoughts to myself and to keep on going to that church because I was confident in my faith. And I think the thing is that I see a lot of people, a lot of Christians who stop going to a church because they don't like the leadership, or stop going to a church because they think that church is not doing what they want it to do or is not fulfilling their need. And I am very, very uncomfortable with that, because I think that as Christians we need to take full responsibility for our own faith and not expect the church to prop up our faith.
Okay.
And if you are getting your faith from the church that you're going to, then you're going to church with the wrong attitude. And for me, my attitude in going to church should be, how can I serve this church? What can I do for this church? Not what can it do for me? And if everybody goes, I think, with that attitude and serves one another, as I believe we should be as Christians, then I think that churches would be an awful lot better. And I do see a lot of people leaving churches because the church isn't fulfilling their particular need. And that to me is not right. And so when we left that church, we did it because we were moving area. Had we stayed in the area, I would have done everything within my power to stay at that church, because I I've never believed that you should leave a church because it's not fulfilling your need or because you don't get on with somebody. You are there to serve, and you keep serving in that church, and you hope that it comes okay. So that's where I'm at with church. I mean,
Okay.
no church is perfect. No person is perfect. There will always be personality differences, and there will always be differences of opinion. And I think you just have to keep serving, take responsibility for your own faith, and continue to serve in that church.
Fair enough. Obviously, you don't know me. We don't know each other.
No.
I do commend you for your honesty. Like you mentioned that
Mhm.
people know that about you. I can tell that that's the case. I
Mhm.
totally agree with that. When I tell you that I was a complete believer, that I believed entirely that Jesus was the Son of God, that he was both the veiling and the revelation of God the Father, that I was born again, that I went to Bible college and studied,
Mhm.
that I was a pastor briefly, that I was all in. When I tell you that I believed in Jesus,
Mhm.
do you have any doubt that I was a quote unquote real Christian?
This question's come up before, and I know it's something that Matt's sensitive about. Do I have any doubt that you were a real Christian? No, I certainly don't have any doubt that you believed you were a Christian. You were an all-in Christian.
You're not going to hurt my feelings, by the way. You can answer honestly here too.
No, I don't have any doubt that you were a Christian. I would ask what your Christian experience was, because what you've said to me is that you believed it, and that you went to Bible college and you pastored and whatever. But what I haven't heard from you is what your experience of the Holy Spirit was, and what your Christian, when I say your Christian experience, I mean your worship experience, your prayer experience,
Yeah.
what that was like.
So, this is an interesting topic in that my wife finds it fascinating that I care at all, that
Right.
she doesn't believe me.
Okay.
And I hear a little of that in your response. And so that's why I wanted to pull this out. I had a very real sense of God's presence. Specifically, I did go to a Pentecostal church. There was a sense of the Holy Spirit. I had a very dramatic, revelatory experience in which I felt that Jesus was telling me to go and tell people how much he loved them. And I was very much what I call a grace junkie. I say that Jesus won my heart when I read the Gospels, and when I went to Bible college, the systematic theology won my brain. And I was convinced that the thing that the Christian church was missing was grace. And that if there were more grace, kind of what you're saying, a little more dedication, a little more, that things would be much better. I had a very real sense of God's presence. I used to call it conscious contact. Just I was maybe not the most disciplined prayer warrior, but I had a sense of God's presence in my life every day. It is weird to try to describe that now. I have a different perspective on it, but the reason that this is important, Sarah, is that for those of us who have gone through the deconversion process, almost the first response is always, you were not a real Christian. Either you were too fundamentalist, or you weren't serious enough, you didn't pray enough. And we find ourselves in this bizarre scenario of defending our former faith. And the reason it's important is that it invalidates our experience to say that we were not a real Christian.
Sure.
And you asked me about why I do this kind of thing. Part of it is as well as to say that for those of us who did have a belief and were very serious about that and then lose it, that experience is different from the kid who grows up and at 12 years old decides, God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's a radically different experience, right? There's something very unique to having had faith and losing it. And so in this bizarre way, it's important for people to understand that that faith was very real at one point in time.
Sure.
So just along these same lines, do you believe that I am capable of morality? Or do you think that because of my lack of faith that I don't have that ability?
Again, going back to the humanism, I mean, as a Christian, I still believe that you, as are all humans, made in the image of God. And if you are made in the image of God, then yes, you must have that same morality, because sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, but if our morality comes from God, if I believe that as a human, my inbuilt morality comes from God because I'm made in his image, I must believe that you were also made in God's image, and therefore you have that same ability for morality that I have. So to me, there's no distinction there. I don't have an issue at all with the morality argument. Isn't something that worries me.
Okay, fair enough. Very similar to that. Do you think that me as a non-believer, that I can have purpose in my life?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that you can. Again, looking at from the point of view of humanity, I see a lot of people who have very meaningful and purposeful connections with other people and gain huge joy and pleasure from those connections. I think that there's an awful lot of surface stuff going on in the world today where people are very, very superficial.
Sure.
And there is a lot of that, and I think we see a lot of that on social media, and we see a lot of that is presented to us. But there's also an awful lot of people who have very deep connections, very meaningful connections with other people, and find huge purpose in that. There's also people that find huge purpose in serving others in some kind of charitable work, and I would never take away from that. There's a lot of people, a lot of atheists, who do an awful lot of very good, purposeful, meaningful work, and you can't ever deny that. I don't think that by any stretch of the imagination that it's just the Christians who are doing the good stuff and having purpose.
Okay.
I think you probably, as an atheist, you would need to make your own purpose perhaps a little bit more. You need to decide what your purpose is going to be and pursue it.
True.
Rather than having that built-in purpose.
I would agree with that statement.
Mm-hmm.
When I say that I no longer believe that any God exists, do you believe that I believe that, or do you think that I am angry at God and I'm just in rebellion?
No, I believe that you genuinely believe that. And I have no problem with people saying that they believe that no God exists. I have more problem with people saying that they are angry with God, because I think if you are saying you're angry with God, then clearly you believe he exists. If the God you're angry with exists, then surely if he's God, he deserves some of your time. So there are people who have deconverted because they say, oh, I'm angry with God, he let me down. That makes a lot less sense to me than somebody who just says, I believe there's no God.
Okay. And the last one, and again, you don't have to be nice to me. Do you believe that I'm going to hell?
Do I believe you're going to hell? I believe that Christians, or those who have faith in God, I mean, to quote John 3:16, have eternal life, and that eternal life will be spent in the presence of God. I don't know beyond that how that works, and I don't know what happens to those who have not made that decision to believe in God or to have faith in God. I don't feel that I don't want to say, and I have relatives who have passed on who have not been believers, and I would struggle with the idea that they are in eternal damnation or in hell.
Okay.
I don't know how I would define hell. I suppose the short answer is no.
Okay.
I don't think that you are. I mean, Revelation says there's going to be a new heaven, a new earth, and we don't know what form that's going to take. So that's not a very good answer, is it? I didn't have a lot of time to think about that, but
it's a little sneaky. The question is a bit sneaky. I'm sorry.
Sure. I mean, there are Christians who would say that hell is an eternity without God. Well, if you've got an eternity without God, then how do you know that? And it's just sort of, so I struggle with this definition of what exactly is hell, what exactly is heaven. I believe that heaven is an eternity in the presence of God and being able to worship him without anything in the way for eternity. But as far as what exactly is hell, I have no idea what that might consist of. I suppose, if anything, I would say you would be missing out on an eternity in the presence of God rather than you're going to hell.
Right.
If that makes sense.
It does. And I'm going to let you off the hook there.
Thank you.
Sarah, again, I just really want to thank you for the level of honesty. I think this was a really compelling conversation, and I hope that both the believers and the non-believers who are listening to this appreciate your bravery.
Thank you.
And your vulnerability and your honesty for coming on the show. So thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, it's been a pleasure, David, and I have to say I've enjoyed it a little more than I thought I would. I was quite nervous, and I've got copious notes here that I've made, and some of the stuff I've said, some I haven't. I've said some other stuff. I'm not sure how it's going to sound when it comes out, but I'm sure I'll listen through gritted teeth, because nobody likes listening to themselves. It's been a good discussion. I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. Well, we might have to have you back on then so you can complete all of your notes.
Thank you.
Final thoughts on the episode. Sarah's an amazing person, and I am very grateful for her coming on the show and sharing her perspective. I think, again, she met me in an honesty contest. There were a couple of moments there where you could really see she was thinking about her answer, maybe in depth, in a way that she hadn't before. I really appreciate that. I don't ever want it to be gotcha questions or somehow to make someone feel bad about what they believe. I respect Sarah's faith tremendously. I respect her dedication to her church and to the outreach to other people. But I think this was an incredibly valuable conversation for us to have. Allowed both of us to air some emotions and to hear the other side. It was important for me to remember the believers in my life have reasons for their faith. It's not that people don't have reasons, they do, even though I disagree with those reasons. Sarah's very powerful line, "This decision that you made on your own affects us. It affects both of us. The core of our relationship was centered around church and being Christians, and now one of us isn't any longer." I really feel that. That's how I felt when I had to tell my wife. I felt like I was ripping the rug right out from underneath her. And I wish that I could make that better, but I can't. I thought we really got to where the rubber meets the road when we were discussing the Alpha course and Sarah and Matthew's daughter going through that and the feeling that Matthew had of that being manipulative. I think children are one of the harder areas for believers and non-believing spouses to grapple with. How do you teach the children? And working through that will be an ongoing challenge. I don't think any of these are a one-time discussion. I think these are ongoing discussions. As I said at the outset, the important thing to remember is that the believers in our lives are full human beings with autonomy and their own intelligence and reasoning for why they believe. And if we minimize and rationalize away their feelings, including their anger towards us, we are doing them a disservice. We need to hear it, feel it, and respond to it with loving kindness, the kind of gentleness that we wanted when we admitted that we were no longer believers. I again want to thank Sarah for her bravery and for her honesty for coming on the podcast. I hope to have more conversations like these in the future. I have at least one more lined up. Sarah is always welcome to come back anytime she wishes to. I hope that you have a wonderful end of the year, celebrating the longest night of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, or celebrating summertime in the Southern Hemisphere. I hope that you reflect upon the year before and hope for the future, what you have planned, and that you find great meaning in this process. Love the people around you with a fierceness that only the knowledge of your own finiteness can bring. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Micaiah Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.